Hello everybody, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about laws, models, theories, and hypotheses. Essentially what we're going to cover today is the intricacies of all of these, how we define them, what they consist of, how we go from one to another, when they're used. We're going to touch on pretty much everything that you need to know about all of these, and we're going to tie in a couple of the concepts we've already been talking about. We're going to tie in some concepts that we're going to talk about in the future as well. I thought I'd throw this one in here. This wasn't necessarily on my plan, but I think it's going to fit in quite well. I think we need to understand how we go from a hypothesis to a theory. It's kind of nuanced in the literature. It relies a lot on the scientific consensus and popularity. But we'll talk about the actual definitions involved, what these are, how we achieve them. So I think this is going to be an insightful episode for you guys. I hope you guys enjoy it. Okay, let's talk about the hypothesis. We talked about this before. I'm going to link the video here, and you can go back and learn about what a good hypothesis is. We're going to touch on that very briefly, but I want to get into a hypothesis in practice, right? How do we test the hypothesis and things of this nature, right? What a hypothesis is beyond what a good hypothesis is, right? Maybe it's more, this will be more fundamental, but essentially what we'll highlight here with the hypothesis, that it is an if-then statement. And of course, we use the germ theory analogy all the time. It's oversimplified, that's for sure. But if a germ causes disease, then an individual gets sick with the introduction of that germ, right? So then the variables, independent variable would be the germ. The dependent variable would be the individual getting sick. So you'd want to isolate that independent variable. You want to isolate the germ in an experiment, and then you would test for that, that phenomenon, if there's a relationship there. So we talked about the variables, the independent and the dependent variables. That's very important to understand. Of course, the independent variable influences the dependent variable. The hypothesis, of course, is looking for the relationship between the variables, right? So we're looking for the relationship. And we know that we can have a positive relationship or a negative relationship. That's the difference between an alternative hypothesis, which would be if this occurs, then this occurs. And we could also have a null hypothesis, right? If this doesn't occur, then this occurs. And it still occurs, right? So there's no relationship, right? That would be a null hypothesis. That would be when there's absolutely no relationship between the independent and the dependent variables. So fundamentally, this is what a hypothesis is, a good hypothesis, right? It needs to be testable. Of course, it should be reproduced. We'll touch on that more in a minute here. Obviously, beyond being simple, clear, and concise, the hypothesis needs to be aligned within the paper. It needs to be aligned with the research question. It needs to be aligned with the methods itself. It needs to be aligned with the initial observation. The results should align with the hypothesis as well. And of course, the discussion needs to align with the hypothesis, right? What we're doing is we're defining the variables that are going to be tested, and it's all going to be explained in the results, right? The data will be raw. We'll have raw data. The problem then becomes statistics and manipulation of the data, because statistics does become more subjective unless presented holistically and truthfully and objectively. But that's one way that we analyze the hypothesis, is through statistics, which we will be touching on more in the future. A null or an alternative hypothesis are both fundamental concepts of statistics. But I want to move more into the hypothesis itself and how it's implemented, how we use it, right? How do we use the hypothesis? Now we were talking about it there briefly, how we use the hypothesis, but essentially what we're doing is we're trying to test the hypothesis, right? That's what everyone hears. We need to test the hypothesis, so we need to conduct an experiment. And so when we conduct the experiment, we've already defined the variables. The hypothesis is almost the theoretical part of it, right? It's the thought process behind it. When we conduct the experiment and we design the experiment, this is where alignment needs to occur, right? We need to isolate the independent variable. That's fundamental, right? We got to isolate the independent variable. I just wanted to highlight that there because that's fundamental within the hypothesis. Isolation of the variable. If we're going to conduct an experiment and utilize a scientific method, isolation of variables is absolutely fundamentally important, right? We need to account for all the confounding variables, which is often not done in science. Sometimes we blatantly use them and trick the readers by using our rhetoric and our words to persuade them into thinking that the experiment was done a certain way to prove a certain thing when in fact it was not, which is why we look at the hypothesis, which is why we look at the methods section of a paper and the results, and not just the abstract and discussion, which are often the most misleading parts of the paper. So of course, the experiment needs to be iterated by the paper. And we talked about scientific style, which you guys can go up and watch that video right there. Because it's important that the experiment and the hypothesis is iterated properly. It needs to be clear and conveyed, right? It needs to be communicated in the right way. So a good hypothesis is not only communicated well and clear and concise, but it's implemented well by a proper experiment that truly tests for the hypothesis, right? The hypothesis needs to be testable. That's the whole point. And the paper, of course, needs to communicate what's going on properly, right? Using our words. This is where words are very important because it's very easy to attribute words to a certain phenomenon and convince the reader that that is true when in fact the words you're using have no real relevance in the conversation. Say we use the term isolation, right? When we isolate the germ in a Koch's postulate experiment. So we isolate the variable, which is great. The term isolate is to separate from all other parts. It needs to be by itself. But in a Koch's postulate study, they use a culture full of a plethora of other chemicals. pH balancers, pH indicators, bovine serum. There are a number of chemicals involved. Often we use adjuvants in cupcake trials, or even Koch's postulates they use adjuvants like aluminum hydroxide. There's a plethora of chemicals in these concoctions, right? They even put antibiotics in these cultures, antimycotics. So it's very important that we truly communicate what's going on well. So if we're going to say the word isolate, something needs to be isolated. These pseudo isolations that are done that we call an isolation is problematic because it's misleading. And this is why this is rhetoric, right? You say, oh, well, we isolated the variable, we isolated the germ, and everyone thinks, wow. No one goes and reads the method or thinks critically about it. And of course, if you do, well, you must be a pseudoscientist or something. The cornerstone of the scientific method and empiricism, and of the hypothesis, really, of an experiment, is reproducibility, right? Retest, test and retest. The problem is that we're not only are we not reproducing studies, is that when we do reproduce studies, they don't reproduce the same results. And this is fundamentally one of the problems with empiricism, is that we conduct these experiments, that we test hypotheses, and if we retest them and test them and test them over and over again, we get different results every time. And a lot of the time, they're statistically insignificant, right? So they don't even abide by their own metrics. Something that's admitted in the literature itself, ironically, is the reproducibility crisis, where it's admitted that especially in psychology, biotechnology, and medicine, those are the most prevalent ones, even in chemistry, that studies and experiments are not reproducible. We cannot retest the hypothesis over and over again and get the same results. Now, the real problem is that I was taught this in university. All university students are taught that we reproduce all of this data all the time. We produce studies all the time. Reproducibility is the cornerstone of science. We do these studies over and over and over again, and they trick you in chemistry class when everyone mixes two chemicals together and you get the same result, right? They kind of trick you into thinking this. Right? So Everyone's got to take that first year chemistry, and we think that all experiments are just conducted like this and we always get the same results. But it's completely wrong. It's completely misrepresentative of what happens, right? You go to biology and then you instantly cannot reproduce your data. It's impossible. It just doesn't occur, right? And so in theory, this is the right way to conduct the scientific experiment and conduct the scientific method and empiricism, right? In theory, on paper, this all sounds great. But it's just not reproducible, right? That's just not what we see in reality. So this is something that we should look for, right? If we're going to conclude that a hypothesis is true, it should be reproduced. It should be reproduced over and over again, and we get the same results. But it just doesn't happen, right? One, there's a lack of funding. Two, when it does happen, we don't get the results. And of course, hypotheses can be tested at different angles. So when we're testing a hypothesis, yes, you could change the variables and the controls, and you could test, essentially, you can conduct the experiment at many different angles. And this is good. This is fine. You know, we shouldn't need all of these different studies to try and prove one hypothesis correct. I mean, this is essentially what they're trying to tell me now, is that one study doesn't prove a hypothesis correct, you need multiple studies. Now, in theory, the perfect study accounts for all the variables, accounts for all the confounding variables. There are none, right? This, in theory, is what should be done. Impossible to be put into practice. It's fine to test all of this stuff at different angles. You know, it's fine that we're doing that. The problem truly lies in the idea that this never ends. This never ends. And they say that we get closer and closer to the objective truth with every experiment. That's the hymn of empiricism again. That at every time that we test and we retest and we conduct a new experiment with slightly different variables and we control different factors, we're getting closer and closer to the truth. In theory, again, this is correct, but it's only when every experiment aligns with the hypothesis. It's only when every experiment does a good job of implementing the scientific method, which is not done in science. And so in theory, yes, this is correct. You should be testing, you should retest the same studies to try and reproduce the results, but you should also test it at different angles and then, of course, reproduce these results. And when you get closer and closer to the truth, but this is not what's actually done in science. This is the implementation of a hypothesis. This is how it gets implemented. It gets tested, right? This is what papers are pretty much all about. This is inductive reasoning, right? This is essentially inductive reasoning. We go from a very specific phenomenon, a very specific conclusion, and draw out to create a larger conclusion, right? Like a theory. So you move essentially from the hypotheses to theories, which is what we'll discuss here next. But testing these hypotheses essentially is how you get theories, right? And the concoction of many hypotheses and many positive hypotheses, I suppose, and negative ones as well in good science, you put them all together and you generate theories. And this is inductive reasoning. This is empiricism. This is what the scientific literature truly aims to do. And then our textbooks, we develop theories and things like this. So hypothesis is generally concerned with experimentation. And now we're going to move into discuss theories and how they're connected. Okay, next we're going to be talking about theories. And in theory, the generation of theories comes from hypothesis. It comes from inductive reasoning. We're going to touch more on that in a moment here. But theory, I liken it to the scientific consensus. And in general, the theory is an explanation of the natural world. So a theory is a general explanation. It's very general. Hypotheses are very specific. And theories are very general. General explanation. So of course we go from hypotheses to theories. They are representations of the scientific consensus. And the last thing I'll say here is that they're built over time. And so generally this is how it goes, right? So you go from conducting a plethora of experiments, you bundle them all up and you create a theory. And this makes sense, right? Of course it relies on the quality of your experiments. It relies on the quality, in this case, of the scientific literature. Because in theory, this is a great way to generate theories based on a number of experiments. So it's also claimed in kind of the scientific communities and the scientific method itself that not only are they built over time, but they're reviewed and renewed over time as well. So they get refined over time. And I mean, like, again, this is good, right? New data should be able to come out and challenge theories. And when new true data comes out, it should be implemented into that theory, right? The theories should be moving. They should be molding with experiments as they go, because this is the notion, right? We conduct more experiments all the time. We test new hypotheses, and multiple experiments now are needed to test one hypothesis for some reason, and essentially what we need is multiple hypotheses to generate a theory. And of course, refinement is important here. When new data comes out that's reproduced, that we know is factual, that we know is true, this is when we need to revamp the theory itself. Obviously, theories are extremely dogmatic now. A great example is the germ theory. They do not want to budge, right? They think that their experiments conducted are enough to prove the germ theory, but it's because we're dogmatically tied to the theories. Because we learn these theories in school from a young age. We spend thousands and thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars on university, years of our lives, 10, 12, 13 years by the time you get a PhD, by the time you get through grad school and through, maybe med school. And so we're so tied to these theories. We're so dogmatic in our thinking that we don't want to accept new literature. We don't want to accept new data. We don't want to accept new explanations of the data. We don't want to accept any confounding variables that may have been present. And so dogma is a problem when it comes to theories. And so a theory encompasses not only hypotheses, but they state that they encompass facts, of course, hypotheses, and laws, which we'll touch on more in the future of this video. So it's not just based on the literature itself, because these are very general, right? They're very general explanations of the phenomena of the world, right? Whereas hypotheses are very specific. They're very specific explanations of an isolated phenomenon. But you implement the facts, right? Now, facts, this is so loose, right? And it's funny, this is what comes up when you're researching this stuff. They say that it encompasses these facts. So what is a fact is another great question to ask yourself. When does something become a fact? What's the difference between a fact and a law, right? We'll touch on a law here in a moment. But this is a sort of nuance. Can be a source of being misleading, right? It can certainly be misleading because what one takes as a fact, another may not, right? It's certainly a fact that every time I drop this piece of chalk in my hand, that it's going to fall. I think that's a fact that we all agree on. Now, the explanation of gravitational fields and why this piece of chalk falls and breaks when it hits the ground, that varies among individuals, right? Is that a factual explanation? Is that a factual why, right? We certainly see the what. We could certainly see what happens, that it happens every time. But when we get into the explanation, the theory of, they call it the law of gravity, of course, that's a fact. That, if you want to call that gravity, but if you want to explain what gravity is, you're drawing up all of these models, which we'll discuss on more and later in this video. All of this is interpreted as facts. based on, again, experiments. Are the experiments done correctly? Another good one is the law of thermodynamics, right? Law of thermodynamics, that everything seems to be seeking a more chaotic state as time goes on. Now, the interesting thing about that is that everything is seeking this sort of entropy, right? You know, human beings are a very ordered being, right? All animals, all life is extremely ordered. And this is a great discussion to have, and a much larger discussion than I'll do justice here. But, you know, it completely goes against the laws of thermodynamics, right? A good law of thermodynamics is that energy is never created or destroyed. You know, that's an observable fact. It's very observable. The idea that everything tends towards a chaotic state is not necessarily a fact, because life contradicts that fact. And so we call it a law because it's supposed to be universal. And obviously the religion of science relies on that universal law, that we are this anomaly in the system. However, it still doesn't align with the laws that are spoken. So let's get back here to the topic at hand, theories. Those are just a couple of little side examples. Going off on a little tangent here. Okay, let's talk quickly about generation of theories. So we mentioned earlier that we go from a hypothesis to a theory, usually. And this is what would be called inductive reasoning. So essentially, inductive reasoning goes from a very specific premise, the hypothesis in this case, to a more general conclusion, which would be the theory. And so you're inducing from the specific case, the specific phenomenon, to create this general idea. That in turn, the general idea can become a set of maybe parameters in which we can deduce information, and this becomes deductive reasoning, when you go from a general conclusion to a specific premise. Now, in the generation of theories, often this doesn't occur. It's usually inductive reasoning. That's the aim of empiricism. So essentially what happens is that we encompass it all. So you take the hypotheses, you take the laws, you take the facts, which are a little subjective. What you do is you take it all of these essentially, and you go and you create a theory. So who decides what a theory is? Right? Obviously the top scientists of the world, the professors, doctors, things of this nature, they get to decide what the theory is based on the hypotheses, the current scientific consensus. It's not one person that's doing this. It's the group think, in a way. Is this the most logical way to go about doing this? Of course not. It's riddled with logical fallacies. Is it the most reasonable? Perhaps. Perhaps it is the most reasonable. Does that mean that it's correct? Absolutely not, right? Because one, we need to look at the hypotheses in question, right? The scientific literature is absolutely polluted, as we've been demonstrating over and over again, and as the literature demonstrates itself with the reproducibility crisis and things of this nature. It's like, what is a fact? What is true here? That's what should be done in the generation of a theory. We really look at what is true. But obviously, we're so dogmatic in our thinking that when we generate these theories, it's based on a premise of lies, right? Like the saturated fat theory, in a way. You know, that animal foods are causing heart disease and their cholesterol is clogging up your arteries. This has come to light in the literature because truth always prevails. The literature can't lie forever. It's coming to light. We know that saturated fats and cholesterol don't cause disease. There's absolutely no empirical evidence for it, and there's no rational explanation for it. There's no reasonable way to deduce that information. So when we generate theories, this is important to consider, right? We take kind of everything. It's just kind of like the scientific consensus, and we put it together and we create these theories. These are seen in textbooks and curriculums, university curriculums, these theories, these ideas that we now deduce from, right? Because what happens is we teach people these theories and then we deduce a bunch of information from it. So now when a bunch of people get sick in a little market in the middle of a big country that has a lot of power. Everybody gets sick, maybe everybody, 20 people get sick, and we go based off the germ theory, we deduce that a germ must be causing this illness. So we go to a lab and we create a test for a certain unicorn, right? And what happens is that we already know that the unicorn is causing this idea because we've deduced from the general theory that's based on the literature, the house of cards, of laws. I mean, in this case, there are not really any laws of the germ, but it all ties in together when generating theories. Now we're deducing this information so that we know, we don't have to go back and do Koch's postulates studies again. We don't have to go back and test some hypothesis to ensure that what we're looking at is true, right? We can deduce from the theory that this is the true phenomenon, just based on the creation of this theory, right? The theory is not a fact, really. It's a very general explanation that we should be able to deduce information from. In theory, we should be able to deduce information from a theory in the empirical way of looking at things. The problem is that all of this is all very great on paper. It's just very, very difficult to implement. And it has not been implemented. If you go and you look at it objectively, you'll realize. But you can't go in with your dogmatic way of thinking. You've got to realize that, the conclusions that you've drawn, the theories that you're grown so fond of, may not be absolutely correct. They might not be absolutely true. So this is essentially the generation of the theory. It's all about inductive reasoning. And now I want to move on and talk a little bit about laws, and then I want to compare theories and laws real quick, and then we'll touch on models. The purpose of a law is truly to state an observation without explaining it, right? So laws, they are not explanations. The problem is that we try to explain laws. Now when we're looking at theories, they provide these explanations based on observations and experimentations. But a law doesn't aim to do that. So the law of gravity, fine, call this whatever you want. But once you start getting into the theory of gravity on why this occurs, it's not a law anymore. And I think this is a confusing aspect of laws. A law is not an explanation. What it is a description. And once we get away from these descriptions and we move towards explanations, we move from laws to theories. However, if initially they're called a law, then we just continue the law. Essentially, laws are just regularities. Regular old observation. And so we take these at face value. We take laws at face value. Yeah, of course, this is observation, right? This is just observation. I'm not going to sit here and say that laws are just dogmatic theories. Although in practice they seem to be that way, right? But in essence, they're not, right? They're just regularities. They're just observation of phenomenon in the natural world. And so, you don't necessarily need to test this, right? Because if you were to create a hypothesis of, when I drop something, it falls down. It happens every time, you don't need to conduct an experiment to prove these observations true. One could state that the law of the sun going up and going down at the end of the day is a regularity, right? And that's a description. It goes up and it comes down. That's the law of our lives. But we've created these models and these descriptions and these explanations of why the sun comes up and goes down. And when you don't necessarily need that explanation, right? Yeah, laws are fine. Laws are fine, right? It's just when we start moving into more theoretical explanations of laws is when you start to lose the validity of a law. It then becomes a theory, right? So nobody talks about the theory of gravity. We always talk about the law of gravity, right? And no one's denying that this doesn't happen, right? But, the models that they give us of these theories are just CGI. They're ridiculous in a way, right? It's just foolish. It's foolish. We're looking at these, these little planes of reality, the fabric of reality, and there's dips in it, and this is why the world spins around. And look, we can demonstrate this by an experiment of a piece of rubber, and we roll a penny around it. It's just, how do we know that experiment, right? How that explanation aligns with the observation, right? You're so far removed, right? This is the basis, essentially, right? This is the basis of the scientific method. But we go back and forth. We go from deduction to induction, back and forth all the time, and we confuse the people with what a law is, what a theory is, and it's quite simple, right? What a law is an observation. It's just an observation. Law is fundamentally what is important in the scientific method, but we get so far away from this. We get stuck in our theories, and we try to create these theories and explanations, and we explain everything. And for some reason, humans have this need to explain everything nowadays. Guilty as charged here. But when it comes to the laws, it's much different than a theory. And so it's funny because when doing research, they actually stated that a law can be manipulated over time, how it can be revised and reviewed. But that's not what a law is, right? Because we've gotten away from what a law is fundamentally. It's like the law of gravity. I keep harping on this, but it's true. That's the reason why they think laws are able to be manipulated and to be revised as new evidence comes about, right? The law is the observation. The law is the regularities. It's just the description. But the reason why we think that a law is malleable is because we've tried to explain laws when that is not what a law is. Law is not an explanation. So let's compare law to a theory real quick. We'll talk about it a little more. We'll get into models. Okay, simply, what is the description of a law? It is an observation. And a theory is an explanation. So if you're talking about the law of gravity and you want to talk about the fabric of reality, then you must distinguish that you're not talking about the law anymore, you're talking about the theory, right? A germ theory is a theory, of course. It's flawed fundamentally because it's based on some bogus, fraudulent literature. But that's essentially the differences between a law and a theory. It's quite simple. So what's the focus of a law? The focus of a law is what? And for theories, it's why. So with a law, we're looking at what is happening, what we can observe, right? What we observe day in and day out that does not change. It never, ever changes. Laws are not malleable. Theories are. Theories are general explanations, right? Laws are just observations. They are what is going on, right? So when we're talking about predictive power, right? Laws have very high predictive power. And for some reason, we think that they have the same predictive power as a theory. But in fact, it is much lower, right? Because theories are malleable. They change with the new literature coming out all the time. It's obviously, with a theory, it's obviously just based on the scientific consensus, and this constantly changes, right? That is the nature of science, that the scientific consensus changes, and therefore the theories are constantly changing. The why, can we actually get to a solid why using empiricism? I don't know, right? Okay, what is a model, right? Models are a very common occurrence in science. And what they are is essentially a mathematical or computational or a physical representation of a certain phenomenon, of a theory, usually. Usually you don't see models of hypotheses, you see them of theories. So a model, in essence, is a representation of an observable phenomenon. Of course, here I wrote that it's a misrepresentation because our theories are fundamentally flawed, because the scientific literature is fundamentally flawed, because theories rely on the scientific literature, they rely on the scientific consensus. And if your foundation is flawed, then everything else becomes crooked. So what models do is they help convey, also known as convince, the reader or the student. And what it does is they convey these complex or questionable phenomenon. So what happens is they obviously generate models to make the stupid idiot layman's understand their complex theories that, one, you should never ever question, because they're so dogmatic in their ways that if you ever question those dogmatic theories, that of course you get put right down. But this is in essence is what happens, is that they're trying to convey this information, this complex information that nobody can understand. But what really occurs is that they're trying to convince you of this rather questionable information, right? And so that essentially is the purpose of a model. So of course models take many forms, and we start with the best one here. So it goes from best to worst, or most misleading. Because obviously anything can be computer generated, so you can CGI image literally anything that you want. You can create anything on a computer, so that's why this is the most misleading and the least factual. Obviously you should not be drawing any sort of conclusions from models, obviously. Visual representations are fine if they're done correctly, if they're based on proper scientific method. Same with mathematical. This is best. Mathematical computation. Truly, mathematics are the language of the universe, I believe. And if we're using mathematics properly to test theories, like say the theory that a heart is a pump, right? That the heart acts solely as a pump. Well, if you conduct the mathematics behind that, if you create a mathematical model of the heart being a pump, and you say, you know, how much force would it take for the heart to, or how much force would the heart need to produce to pump the blood through the kilometers of blood vessels that we have through the capillaries, in which the red blood vessels or the red blood cells are actually larger than the capillaries themselves, right? It would take a tremendous amount of force, more than the heart can physically generate. Therefore, the theory is fundamentally flawed. So you can use these mathematical formulas, right? You can use these mathematical models to try and disprove what's going on. And I think that's absolutely amazing, right? So that's why mathematical models are the best forms, obviously, because you can verify what's going on, right? Because when things don't mathematically align, well, then you know your theory is just completely flawed, it's completely bogus. And so that's important. Obviously, I'm sure there is a way to mislead with mathematics, especially when it comes to statistics, but you know, generally if you're using true mathematics, true equations, I think that it's rather sound. This is something that I am going to be looking more into in the future. Mathematics are not something I'm extremely well versed in, but you know, I am very convinced of the idea that the mathematics need to align with a certain model or theory for it to be true. So I think that's fundamentally important to understand. Obviously, we know that CGI is absolutely bogus. You could literally generate absolutely anything. And like a visual picture or visual physical representation, you can, in theory, do absolutely anything with it, right? You could be creative, right? You could be creative and create anything. So I want to highlight two models that are problematic. We have the cell membrane model. That is a lipid bilayer that can only be seen under electron microscopy. And it's said to be all of these phospholipids stacked up with each other. Just something like this, right? This in essence is the model. And they have these proteins within these these models, all these different proteins, they have these surface proteins. Gerald Pollack has done a great job at disproving this model. The lipid bilayer theory is flawed. Obviously, there's cholesterol embedded in here, right? They can really make these models as complex or as simple as you'd like, right? Because you're computer generating it. So they can add all of these proteins and these cholesterols to make you really think like, wow, we really have a great understanding of what's going on here. But Gerald Pollack does a great job at dismantling the theory of the phospholipid bilayer, right? The experiments, he runs experiments that don't align with the theory, right? So when these new experiments, these new hypotheses that are being tested are found, we need to change the models, change the theories, right? And that's what doesn't occur because we're so dogmatic, because we see this in all our textbooks, we just take it as a fact when it's not a fact. We think that this is observable through electron microscopy when electron microscopy is distorted and creates artifacts, right? That's the problem with electron microscopy. It's not true observation. It's not even true empiricism in my mind. So another model that's very poor is that we have the model of the atom, right? And really, it's so useless, right? Except for when it comes to chemistry and biochemistry. Because it's like all of these electrons, this is the most probable area for these electrons to be. But at any given point, an electron could be here, but it could also be over here. Or it could be here, right? This electron here could be over here. It could be anywhere in the universe at any given time, right? So obviously this is really only useful when it comes to chemistry and biochemistry. And, we have to evaluate how useful models are as well. I know that this model of the atom has never helped anyone be cured from any diseases. No one's ever been helped by this model. People will say, oh, well, we've had advances in chemistry and they've helped us with technology, and technology is so useful. It also makes us lazier. It also makes us more comfortable, which is problematic for the mind. It also makes us distrust our reality because we think that we're gods because we can create anything that we want. It's distorted our reality, right? So it's important to understand that just because we have a model at the best representation of a physical phenomenon, of an observable phenomenon, doesn't necessarily mean that the model's correct, because they can be extremely incorrect. Well, it doesn't mean that it's useful either, right? Because this is just the most probable area for it to happen, right? For these electrons to be. And then you simplify this. So you simplify this and say you're in biochemistry and you have these, now you have this model. And then you're trying to reduce it. You've already reduced it, and so forth, right? And then you have this other molecule that comes up and takes this hydrogen away, and right, so you're reducing all this. And so, pharmacology relies on this. Pharmacology relies on this. True health has nothing to do with that. I don't care about that, right? Oh, that's where the electrons are most probable. If you look at quantum mechanics, look at anything deeper than that, right? We reduce it and we continue to reduce it over and over again. And then you take this, say this is a longer chain, right? To say it's a much longer chain of a fatty acid, and then this is the fatty acid here. So we reduce it further. This is this over here. But now what about this? And we just make models and more models, and we just convince everybody that this is the facts, that this is the truth of reality, because these are the theories that we've generated based on the house of cards of experimentation that we've been doing, right? All of these technologies that we've created, like electron microscopy, that doesn't actually observe anything because we distort it. What is the gold standard of electron microscopy? There is none. Unless you could see on that scale with a microscope that you don't need stains and you don't need to beam these high density electron beams through, and you don't need to freeze it and dehydrate it, and all of these different steps that they take, right? There's nothing to control that. So it's important to understand that models can be very misleading. Just because something is a model doesn't mean that it's true. Just because something is a theory doesn't mean that it's true. If you want to get back to what's more true, go back and look at hypotheses, go look at experiments, go look at what's done in experiments, go make sure the experiment aligns, you can see that all of this is just one huge house of cards, right? It all relies on these very specific phenomenon. This is empiricism, right? It all relies on these very specific experiments. And when you go down and you try and refine and you're reducing everything to these models, you're so far away from the experiment that it's just ridiculous, right? You don't need to take this at face value. We've dogmatically accepted all of this. We need to trust this, right? Science is a religion now. You need to trust in the model, right? Trust in the textbooks. It's absolutely ridiculous. Okay, I really hope you guys enjoyed this little lecture here. I guess that was kind of long. We went over hypotheses again. We went over theories. We went over laws and how they're different from theories. We also went over models and how they're a representation of theories and observable phenomena in the universe. So we try to model out laws as well, like the law of gravity. But you're not modeling out a law because the law is not an explanation. The law is the observation, right? We're modeling theories. You're modeling the theory of gravity. You're modeling the theory of the representation of gravity, even at that, right? Because gravity in itself, whatever you want to call it, things fall down theory or law, right? This happens all the time. It's observable. So we talked about the inductive nature, the empirical nature of the scientific method, something that we'll be talking about more moving forward. Obviously, you can kind of see how it's flawed, how it's all built upon itself. And now that we know the scientific literature is polluted and absolutely flawed, we're understanding now that this is all just a big house of cards. So all of these models that we have that I was just showing you guys, and all of these observations and all the observations don't align with the theories. They don't align with these theories in these textbooks. We have these textbooks full of theories and, models and experiments that were done, but go and evaluate the experiments themselves that all of this relies on, and you could see that it's flawed, right? You can't reproduce these studies. Even if they did reproduce them, they would get skewed results, different results every single time. Right? Can we even isolate variables? Can we even positively test hypotheses? Does hypothesis testing actually have anything to do with nature itself? Can we isolate things? Does the isolation of something actually represent what happens in nature? Because nothing's isolated in nature. Everything works in unison together. These are the problems with empiricism. These are the problems with the scientific method. These are the problems with models and theories and hypotheses, right? This is all great on paper. It's all great on paper. I got no problem with laws, right? Because if we're looking at laws from the true standpoint as well, like what are we observing? The law of the sun. The law of the sun goes up and goes down, right? The law of the moon, that it runs on a 28-day cycle. These are observations. That's the foundation of the scientific method. That it almost comes full circle, but there is no circle, right? Because there was no foundation. Empiricism relies on a foundation. It is not circular. It's linear. You go from a very specific premise to a more general conclusion, a more general theory. You model that, right? It's linear. It's not circular. A law and an observation, they try to fit it into their theories to confuse us. Because they give us half-truths, right? Like with the germ theory, they say, germs are present at the site of disease, but they tell us that they're the root cause of disease. Well, they're present at the site of disease, but they're bioremediating factors. They're not a root cause of disease. They feed us these half-truths. They feed us half the truth, right? Oh, look at the law of gravity. Now look at the model of why this happens. This is true because look, this is true, so this is true. But it's foolish. It makes no sense. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this. All my links are down below. Give me a follow, like, subscribe if this was helpful, insightful in any way. Leave a comment down below and tell me what you think. Tell me what you think of the lecture itself, the content, my presentation. If you want to donate, you absolutely can. It'd be very welcome. I really appreciate it. It's absolutely not necessary, but it would certainly help me dedicate more time to doing this. I love talking about this stuff, guys. So if you guys want to discuss, you can message me on Instagram. You can also comment down below. I get down to my comments there. I always get to them, but I'm worse at responding to them than Instagram. So if you really want to chat, it's better than on Instagram. But yeah, if you enjoyed it, yeah, you know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe. So catch you guys later, man. I hope you guys enjoyed it.